Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content. A lone cowboy comes to a leisurely halt along the side of a dusty trail. Standing in his path are three of the deadliest outlaws in the Indian Territory, the notorious Brunter brothers. They are thieves, killers, armed and extremely dangerous. Bass Reeves dismounts and approaches them. He is an intimidating, serious-looking man, standing over 6 feet tall and solidly built. His beat-up black hat and long black coat are covered with dust from several thousand miles of hard riding and hard fighting. The brass star proudly displayed on his lapel is tarnished with age.
What are you doing out here, lawman?
The elder brother demands, gesturing with his rifle.
Well, come to arrest you,
Reeves says.
Got the warrant right here.
The eldest brother snatches the warrant and jokingly shows his brothers the lengthy list of serious charges leveled against them. Then, in a flash, they raise their guns. Reeves's right hand closes around the handle of his .45 caliber Colt Peacemaker. He draws the weapon from the thigh holster and fires 2 shots from the hip in rapid succession. Both bullets hit home, dropping 2 Brunters. The eldest points his rifle at the lawman's head, but Reeves grabs the gun with one hand, redirects it so the shot goes wide, and then proceeds to knock the man unconscious with a blow from his pistol. And then, just like that, the fight is over. And Bass Reeves has once again emerged unscathed and victorious. Hello, and welcome back to Badass of the Week. My name is Ben Thompson, and I am joined once again by recurring guest Brandon Fibbs, Senator.
Hello,
Brandon
sir.
Fibbs. I learned it last time.
That's my call sign? Yeah,
yes.
Indeed it was.
Well, welcome back to the show. Thank you
sir.
so much for coming on. As always, You've been on here long enough that I feel like I don't have to go through the whole, Brandon works on this podcast and he's done these things and these things, because I feel like...
Brandon was born in Portland, Oregon in 19 blah, blah, blah.
Which is always the hardest part of doing this anyway. I always struggle with, like, that part is a thing that it seems so easy when you hear podcasters and interviewers and journalists do that well. Like, oh, well, he's done this and he did this and hello, welcome so much for being on the show, blah, blah, blah. And like, that was the thing that it seems so natural that I didn't realize you have to prepare a lot of that in advance when you're going to interview a person. So like the first couple times I feel like we had guests on these shows, I feel like I was just like, hey, what's up? And then when it was over, it's like, okay, well, bye. You know?
Especially when you interview someone who has like lots of credentials, and then like you're like, how do I distill this down into the one thing that is going to best represent them?
Right. The one way that I would know them might not be the same thing. Like, my father was a big Jason Momoa fan, and he was that guy from Stargate Atlantis. I'm like, okay, well, I think people might think about him as being
right.
the Khal Drogo guy, but...
It's true. That's half the fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's awesome. Anyway, thank you so much, as always, for being on the show. You are coming to us with like one of my favorite badasses ever. This is a guy that I put in the first Badass book, and I feel like I would rewrite that chapter now if I had the opportunity to do it, because there's so much more cool things that didn't even make it into the book. But this guy is like one of my favorite characters. He has kind of had a renaissance over the last couple of years.
Just a couple of years, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I had never heard the name Bass Reeves before I kind of started digging into research for the first Badass book. But there's a TV show now, and there's a couple of TV shows in development. And now we're starting to see more stuff about Bass Reeves, which is really awesome. And so, yeah, Brandon, let's, what got you into the story?
I discovered, okay, so I feel like a broken record, because I feel like every single time I'm on this show, I talk about discovering a person who, after having discovered them, I think, how on earth is this person not a household name? How does every child in America not know exactly who this person is?
That's true of everybody that you've talked about, though, too, right?
Yeah.
Like, okay, we did Neil Armstrong, but, Eugene Bullard and the Night Witches and some of the other people you've come on to talk about. It's like, how are these people not, like, national heroes? Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I discovered Bass Reeves a couple years ago when I was before I became very delinquent on my TikTok channel. For every day for Black History Month, I would just profile a new person that you probably hadn't heard of. And in doing research for that, I discovered Bass Reeves. And that was one of those that's like, wait, is this story true? Because this feels like it's manufactured perfectly tailored for the best movie you've ever seen, or your favorite Western series. I mean, it was one of those things where I was like, this is seriously one of the greatest, most substantive peace officers, lawmen in the history of the American Western frontier. And how am I just now discovering him? And I have to admit, based on the comments that came in on that TikTok video, everyone else felt exactly the same. This is somebody everyone loves learning about.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the thing. Like, I had a similar experience where I was like, is this like, is this a recap of a novel or like a comic book or something? And it's like, no, there's pictures of this guy. Like, a lot of this stuff was written down and by firsthand accounts of meeting him and talking to him and seeing him do his thing. So Bass Reeves, he's a U.S. Marshal. He's a lawman in kind of the Red Dead Redemption 2 time period, like the end of the gunslinger era. And he is he's going to be a really awesome story, and I'm really excited to talk about him. So we are going to take a really quick break for a commercial, but before we do that, I wanted to kind of set the stage here with a quote, because like I said, we have stuff by these guys and firsthand accounts, and there's a report that he had given, and it was about capturing some bad guy. And a lot of the heroes of the Old West are these outlaws, but this guy was a lawman. He was hunting those bad guys down. He was bringing them in with amazing regularity, as we will see. But the quote that I love was one that he was talking about. He was going for bad guys, and they pulled a gun on him. They started shooting, and they're in a gunfight. And he says, quote, "He stepped out into the open, 500 yards away, and commenced shooting with his Winchester rifle. The first bullet cut a button off my coat, and the second cut my bridle rein in two. I shifted my six-shooter and grabbed my Winchester and shot twice. He dropped, and when I picked him up, I found that my two bullets had hit within a half inch of each other." So that's what we're dealing with here, and that's who Brandon's going to tell us about when we get back from this break. All right, welcome back to Badass of the Week. We are here with fellow badass aficionado Brandon Fibbs.
And I'm putting that on my tombstone.
Yes. Well, I always think about that because I'm like, well, not fellow badass, because I don't really consider myself a badass. I like to talk about them. I can appreciate them.
And the more you learn about some of these badasses, you're like, yeah, that is definitely not me.
Absolutely. And Bass Reeves is one of those guys that you're like, okay, yeah, no, I'm definitely not going to be doing some of the things that this guy was doing. So why don't you tell us about Bass Reeves?
You bet. Well, I am one of those people who love starting at the beginning, because the sort of like the beginning generally holds the sort of the nuggets of the DNA of why a person becomes who they are and what they do. And Bass Reeves is one of those amazing stories where he's a guy who is born into slavery in Arkansas in 1838, and later went to fight in the Civil War because his enslaver, Colonel George R. Reeves, who was a Texas sheriff and legislator and one-time Speaker of the House in the Texas House of Representatives, he goes off to join the Confederate Army, and he takes Reeves with him. And
which was common. That happened
which
quite
was
a bit in the Civil War,
which was absolutely common. Yeah. And at one point, there's like different stories about whether it was over a poker game or whatever. Reeves attacks his enslaver and escapes. The reason I bring all this up is just because he escapes and is sheltered by several Native American tribes, several of the indigenous people of the area. And he spends the rest of the Civil War sheltering with them, learning their languages, learning their customs, learning how to track, learning how to, like, all these amazing survival skills out in the wild. And so that at the time when slavery is finally abolished, when he returns back home, he is now intimately familiar with cultures and landscapes and survival customs and stuff like that he never would have had access to had he not experienced those things. And those are the very things that kind of set the foundation for everything that he was going to be later in life.
Yeah, and that's one part of the story that I really like, because when he does escape, he doesn't head north, he heads west into what was called the Indian Territory at the time. It's like kind of present day Oklahoma, which is a little easier bit of a getaway than if you're in Arkansas, right? And he lives with the Seminole. He lives with a couple other tribes out there and learns the languages, learns, like you said, the land, because that's gonna help him out a lot in the rest of his career. I also have to say I like what you said about doing this chronologically, because right before we started recording the episode, I was like, do you want to walk through this? You're like, I'm just going to do it in chronological order. And I was like, that's the awesome thing about doing history stuff. It's like, we don't even need to review this outline. We'll just do it in order. That's easy.
Yeah. That's the nice thing about history, is that everything is built upon the previous thing, and earlier things explain latter things. And yeah, we could of course tell the story in lots of different ways, but it's those early years are just so informative to who he's going to become.
Yes. So the Civil War ends. Slavery is abolished. Reeves has been living with the Seminole and a couple other tribes in the Indian Territory. And after the war ends, he comes back to Arkansas.
Goes back to Arkansas and becomes a farmer. And it's not like his life becomes all that dramatic overnight. He actually spends about a decade as a farmer. But he also on the side is learning that he can make a lot more money as a guide for the U.S. government. And you have a lot of people coming into that Indian Territory, a lot of government officials and even lawmen who are coming into that territory, needing to get through it, but needing a guide who can show them where to go and how to safely navigate it. And he boasted that he knew the Indian Territory like a cook knows her kitchen. And so he became that man. And so the really cool part is that by 1875, when President Ulysses S. Grant mandates that the Indian Territory, exactly what you're saying, which is now basically Oklahoma and Arkansas, and was at the time a massive haven for criminals, given its vast size and sparse population, Grant was like, this place needs to be cleaned up. And to do that, of course, would require hundreds of brand new U.S. Marshals. And Reeves, who's already been showing people around and guiding people, already knows the indigenous people of the area, already speaks the language. Not surprisingly, at age 37, he's recruited as the first Black U.S. Marshal.
Right, which is just, and this is one of these ones where you're like, why haven't we heard this story before? Because he's one of the original guys. And, the Indian Territory is a big problem right now, because you're having these gunslingers and these gunfighters, and these are like hardened criminals, right, of all shapes and sizes. But because this area was not very heavily patrolled or populated, like you said, this was the place. Like if you were a wanted criminal and you needed to go somewhere, this was a place where you could go, where that is and so when you need guys to go in there and get them out, Bass Reeves, he's got the skills, he's got the tools, the strength, the intelligence, the understanding, the aptitude, and this is the thing that he really takes to, right?
Yeah, it really takes to, and it is extraordinary. Like you talk about it, like this is the cliche in every Western movie we grew up watching, where some lawman has to go into some forbidden territory that's just this immense space to try to locate some bad guy who's hiding out in the hills. I mean, that's exactly what he did.
He was not just hanging out in the hills, but like hanging out with his gang in the hills.
So you
exactly. Go by yourself on your horse. It's you and your horse against who knows how many guys who would rather shoot you than be brought back to justice.
And the insane thing is that of all of these new marshals that are hired, he is assigned to a 75,000 square mile territory west of the Mississippi River. I cannot even conceive how one person is responsible for that much space. That's insane.
If you had a car, you couldn't patrol that.
You're right.
And it was
exactly
paved,
right?
If it was highway, you couldn't patrol that amount of interstate.
And it was a crazy, like, so, I guess maybe this is something we should have talked about earlier, but like just describing the man himself. This is the man who is starting off as this deputy marshal. He is 6'2". He's 200 pounds. He's got this thick handlebar mustache. He wears this wide brimmed hat. I mean, he was, and as you mentioned at the opening, he was a crack rifle and pistol shot with either hand. Like, this guy is cut from Western stereotypes of the best kind of way. Like, this guy he was straight out of Central Casting.
Yes. I don't know if you saw, they did a remake of The Magnificent Seven with Chris Pratt's in it and a couple other people are in it. Denzel Washington is the lead in that. And he plays a very Bass Reeves character. It came out a couple years ago. I liked it a lot. But yeah, his character in The Magnificent Seven is the same thing. Dressed in all black, big hat, 2 pistols, lawman, and just the attitude, the look, everything was just, I felt like it was perfect for a Bass Reeves type character.
I need to check that out. I never did. That is, as I'm a massive James Horner fan, and that was James Horner's final score that he composed before.
That's great. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'll have to check it out. And I guess we should also say, speaking of amazing, and this is not cut from that sort of like cliche, is the fact that, can you imagine in this era, we are, all these Jim Crow laws at the end of Reconstruction are flying around. And here's this African-American deputy U.S. Marshal who's working in the Indian Territory. And he's given the authority to arrest whites, blacks, Indians, anyone who breaks federal law. This, like, he is already he already has a target on him. Just because of the color of his skin, not just because of the star in his chest.
Right, which is also a target. Like a lot of these marshals are being a lot of them are being shot at, and many of them are being killed trying to do this. Right, and
over the course. Sorry, please continue.
I was going to say these bandits, these criminals that are out here, they don't want to be brought in by any cop, let alone this guy. Right, and so there's a whole other side. So we've talked about this in a couple of the other episodes you've come on, but like his job is even harder than the John Wayne guy's job.
Absolutely. And you are not wrong about the danger. I read that something like 120 of the marshals and various other lawmen were killed during his tenure of working. He was actually one of the lucky ones, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. He developed a reputation for his ability to catch outlaws that no one else could do. He did this as an illiterate man. He would memorize his warrants and go out and find these guys. He often worked in disguise to try to hunt them down and stuff like that. And the insane thing is that he did this for 30 years. So he's starting at almost 40 years old. And he does this for 30 years working as this federal peace officer. And over that time, he not only brought in some of the era's most dangerous outlaws, but he's recorded to have brought in potentially 3,000 felons over 30 years. That has to be some sort of outrageous statistic that I don't know if anyone else can even touch.
Yeah, 3,000 guys over 30 years. He can. I mean, and that's a lot. That's like, I mean, what's that? 300 a year? Is that right?
Math is probably not our strong suit, or else we wouldn't be doing this podcast. But if we were, that's probably an impressive, breakdown.
But that's like a guy a day for like 30 years. And yeah, like you said, he didn't, he could speak a half dozen languages, but they would read him the warrant and the description of the guy. Maybe there's pictures and stuff, but like they'd read him the warrant and he would just remember it and he'd go get the guy. And he always got his guy. There was one time they talk about like he went out on one mission. They said he brought back 17 guys with him. just by himself. And like, you don't think like one of those guys was going to try to like make a break for it every once in a
Right.
while?
I mean, it's hardly surprising that he becomes like literally the most feared deputy U.S. Marshal in the entire Indian Territory. I mean, there's that one story about there's a notorious horse thief, Belle Starr, and when she found out who was after her, she just surrendered. Like she was like, I'm done. I'm not even going to try to escape. As soon as she found out that he was after her, she like just went and turned herself in. She's like, I probably won't survive this if I try to run.
Yep, the bandit queen of Dallas, Belle Starr, who's also pretty badass. We didn't realize.
Who's also pretty bad. Yeah, she has her own extensive Wikipedia page.
She was a 16-year career of like stagecoach robbery and horse thievery and all that, and she wore these real fancy, elaborate outfits while she would do it. So she was kind of a minor. She was the most high profile person he might have brought in. Okay, I just need to pause here for a minute and let's hear from our sponsors. All right, welcome back. But there were some pretty hardened killers and murderers, and because this is the Old West, like sometimes dead or alive is sometimes there's no other way to do it. Guy shooting at you, you really aren't gonna deploy taser, in 1887 or whatever. So he does end up getting into some gunfights. That's a thing that happens to him quite a bit. While the number I've seen is that he had killed 14 men in gunfights.
Yeah, I think he said 14, and other sources were like it may have been closer to 20 or 30. They weren't saying that in an accusatory way. They were saying that he may have even been downplaying all of the very successful gunfights he was in. But what you alluded earlier to the fact, like, he got a button shot off and he got like, the horse bridle cut in half and stuff. At one point he had his hat shot right off of his head. But that's the closest. Like, he had so many of these near misses where bullets are literally peeling pieces of clothes off his body. And he was never hit. In any of these gunfights over these 30 years, he was never injured in any of these battles. It's crazy.
It's what you said. Like, that's what makes it sound like a comic book, right? 30 years, 3,000 criminals. He's bringing in 17 guys at once. He's taking out there's a bank robber named Bob Dozier who was like really well known as a really bad guy, and he gets into a gunfight with him and kills that guy. And then so like not only did he never fail to bring in his guy, he never got hit in a gunfight. And of those 14 gunfights that like he ended up killing the other guy, because he's not an outlaw, he's a lawman. So those shootings are investigated as they are today and stuff. And so they had to check him out and be like, actually, that was a good shooting, right? Like, I think the standards might have been a little bit lower in the 1880s than they are today, right. But he was getting shot at a lot and winning 14 life or death gunfights. It's more people that were killed in gunfights by him than by guys like Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, Billy the Kid, Wild Bill Hickok. And so he won more.
All names we know,
right?
All those names we know growing up, but we didn't learn his name.
We didn't learn his name. But that is starting to change, I think. I have been seeing some stuff recently with him in it, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that was one of the things when I did that TikTok. I had so many people be like, this guy's life needs to be a movie. Why isn't this guy's life a movie? And it was almost like the universe heard us, because then all of a sudden he appeared. Delroy Lindo played him in The Harder They Fall, which was a great sort of modern Western. And then, of course, David Aiello played him in Lawman, Bass Reeves on Paramount Plus, the Taylor Sheridan show. So, yes, although I should say I haven't seen the show, but quite a few people said it played so fast and loose with history that it bothered a lot of people. But it still did present this definite larger than life sort of titanic superhuman character that, according to pretty much every historical source, says he actually was. So it's pretty incredible stuff.
Yeah. Completely spotless record. Couldn't be bought, couldn't be bribed, couldn't be paid off. He was going to come after you. He was going to get his man. I mean, this is a TV show that you would see in like you should that should have been on in like the 60s. This is like a Gunsmoke. Every episode he gets out there, he finds a guy, brings him in. Like that's what that makes me think of, that kind of thing. And one of the interesting things with Reeves is that because he's kind of operating at the end of the gunslinger era, he lives through the Civil War. He has this long career that spans basically the entire Wild West time period. So he's there at the beginning, which is generally placed as the end of the Civil War, being the beginning of like the gunfighter time period. But he's still working into the 1900s. He's still a cop, and he gets a job. His branch of the Marshals is disbanded in 1907, and he's like 70 years old, and he starts walking the beat as a police officer for the Muskogee Police Department. And then, he's got a cane and a revolver, and he's walking a police beat. And there's photographs of him, and it must have been wild because he's kind of there at the height of this gunslinger era. But then, around the time of his death in 1910, we're starting to get cars and, photographs, and it's just wild, the change in the world during his lifetime.
According to the reports too, that 68 almost 70-year-old man on that beat had like the safest beat in the city. Like everyone was like, even at that age, nobody messed with him and everybody behaved, and if they didn't, he caught them, and it was still just like an extraordinary thing. It is sad that he lived through slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and everything that came after it, all through the Wild West, exactly like you're talking about, that quintessential Wild West. And then Oklahoma, as you said, becomes a state in 1907, and now he joins like a normal sort of like city police department. And it's sad that only 2 years after that is when he did die, as you mentioned, at 71 from kidney disease. But all these stories, Wild West, and yet he still dies at the beginning of the same century that I was born in, like that we were born in. It's still 1910. Like in some ways that feels far away, and in other ways it absolutely is not. Like you're just a couple years away from the start of World War I. So this man's career stretches across just an amazing swath of
That's always such an interesting thing, right? Like, because I think about like my grandma knew people that fought in the Civil War.
Oh yeah.
That seems like so long ago when you think about it. And when you're looking at timelines of history, you'd have to scroll really far back to go to 1865. But like my grandma knew people that fought in it, right?
Totally. Yeah. My great grandmother was alive to watch the Wright brothers fly at Kitty Hawk.
Whoa.
And was alive all through the space age and going to the moon. And like there are certain epochs in American history, and American history is not that long. When you consider it in the terms of like generations or lives, it's not that long.
Yeah.
But when you consider that one person was alive to witness the very first flight and landing on another planetary body, you just kind of realize that, man, some people have seen some extraordinary things in their lives.
Yeah, no kidding. and that is that's what we're seeing with Bass Reeves, and he had kind of lived through this wild time of being on horseback, and then by the time he's walking the streets of Muskogee, he's seeing the first cars
driving by.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in some ways we've painted this grand rosy picture, and more or less historically, from the vantage point of history, it was. But that isn't to say that he didn't have a couple speed bumps in his career. You talked about him being unimpeachable and you couldn't buy him and all these sorts of things, but it isn't to say that he didn't face down some things that weren't even the criminals. Like he went to jail himself and almost got convicted for murder because he shot his cook. Back in this time, like he wasn't riding alone in a horse. He had a wagon with him with a cook and sometimes several other people that were part of like his support staff as he went off on all these things. And there's conflicting reports that it's either he got in a fight with his cook after the cook's dog got into the food and he shot the cook. That's what some people claimed. Other witnesses who said they were there said that no, he was cleaning his rifle and accidentally shot the cook. But either way, he shot and killed his cook.
Oh, geez.
And ended up going to jail and having to be finally, he was arrested, and then was acquitted after testifying that the shooting was an accident. And I think pretty much everyone, knowing his character and everything, his reputation, stuff like that, said, they believed that, and he was discharged and put back into duty. Whatever the truth was in terms of like how his cook had died, that really bankrupted him. Like having to support himself and try to, that trial ruined him financially. He had to sell that family farm that he'd been on for a decade. And there's like some speculation that he probably wouldn't have worked until he was nearly 70 years old had it not been for the fact that he had run out of money and then had to keep working after that.
That's too bad. That's too bad.
But I should say also that the most famous person he arrested isn't one of the biggest outlaws of the era. He even arrested his own son Benny, who had killed his estranged wife after he discovered that she was cheating on him. And there's one source that said that Reeves said, "Now, Benny, you are no more my son. You committed a crime, and I have a warrant in my pocket for you to bring you in dead or alive. And I'm going to take you in today, one way or the other." And he did. He took his own son in. His son was tried, convicted, sent to Leavenworth Prison for life, but was released after 11 years. Never got into trouble again, but he also never spoke to his father again.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the job, right? That's what you got to do sometimes. That's one of those things. But yeah, he got the warrant and he took it and he did it. I mean, probably knowing that he was never going to talk to his son again after that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this was a tough time period, and he probably saw some pretty serious stuff and had to do some pretty serious stuff. The exact details of all of his missions aren't available, but I'm sure there was some pretty hairy things going on.
Yeah.
But that's the Wild West for you, I guess.
That's the Wild West for you. And I think that we seem to think, I think we have in our minds sometimes that we are so bad at telling time. We're so bad about recognizing what era is connected to what other era, what comes right before, because we always do think about this Wild West era with 6-shooters and horses running and saloon doors opening and closing and all this kind of stuff. But exactly like you said, the people who were alive in that era were also still alive long enough to see the change of the century and cars and everything else like that. I think we separate these two events so far, but it's not so far. Mm-hmm. There are quite a few people who lived through those events who moved straight into what we would call, even from our 21st century vantage point, modernity. Yeah. And it's just kind of crazy, the stories that I think so many people in the early 1900s actually, as they sat in their normal houses with normal streets and cars driving by, probably had some of the craziest stories to tell.
And there's also this thing that you just touched on with the saloon doors and the gunfighters and things. And, there is this way of looking at this time period through the lens of Unforgiven and Tombstone, where it's just like, dudes were walking down the street carrying guns, shooting everything that moved. You're going to talk to me, I'll shoot you. And then I'm going to shoot you. Then you killed my brother, I'm going to shoot you. And so everybody's just wasting everybody all over the place. But then you get a story like what you just said, where it's like, oh, my gun went off while I was cleaning it, and I shot my cook, and now I have to go to trial for that. I get put in jail, and I got to get a lawyer. It's going to bankrupt. I got to sell the farm to pay for this lawyer. Like, that's not the sort of story you think about when you're trying to picture like Wild West gunslingers. Like, this lawyer is like costing me so much money, but I.
That sounds pretty modern.
Yeah. But so there's, in some ways it adds depth to Bass Reeves and his time period, because these guys are dealing with, it's more well-rounded than just you walk down the street and there's 12 guys show up on top of the saloon with rifles and you got to just kind of shoot them all down.
Right.
He had to go out into this uncharted territory. He had to find guys who didn't want to be found, who were sometimes traveling with a gang or a group of people, like-minded bandits who maybe you weren't expecting. You've got to find these guys. You've got to not get ambushed by them. You got to get them. You got to bring them back, alive or dead, preferably alive. And you've got to do it in a way that is by the book enough that you don't end up, because you are being held to
becoming the
law.
one in trouble yourself.
Right.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And so, and you've got to do it, whatever it was, 300 times a year or something. So,
well, and clearly, one of the nice things is, as you mentioned, all of the different movies and TV shows in which he's starting to appear. Mm-hmm. And there's now a bronze statue of him in Arkansas, and Oklahoma's named the Bass Reeves Memorial Bridge.
Oh,
the world is finally starting to wake up to some of these stories, of the stories that were obviously just suppressed. We weren't telling stories of indigenous people. We weren't telling stories of people of color. But now, finally, some of these stories are coming out and are kind of blowing people away.
Yeah, I had heard some stories that some talk that he had been relatively famous, at least regionally, in his own time, and then a lot of those stories just didn't get retold. Just didn't make it into the history book for whatever
pretty clear reasons.
But like during his life, he was, he had a level of fame that was, greater than it is today.
Absolutely. And even when he died, I read some of the obituaries that were written in some of the newspapers, and not even obituaries, like the newspapers were writing about him as the greatest lawman. Regardless of skin color, this was the greatest lawman that the West has ever seen.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's how he should be remembered, because that's what I believe he was. You don't get into that many gunfights and bring down that many criminals without being pretty badass, I don't think.
Well, I mean, and it is pretty saying something pretty amazing, both about mythology, American sort of entertainment mythology, and about how and why we suppress certain people's stories, that he is said to be the inspiration for the Lone Ranger.
Really?
A black officer is the inspiration for a very fictional white character, the Lone Ranger. But yeah, it is said that it was his life on which that character was based. I
could see it. I can, now that you say it, I can totally see it, but I would never have put that together. Interesting. Oh, that's really cool. Well, Brandon, thank you so much as always for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
I love talking about this stuff with you. So it's really fun to have you on. And you always suggest my favorite badasses, which I like.
That's good. You know what they say about great minds.
Well, thank you so much. Would you want to remind everybody where they can find your stuff?
The aforementioned TikTok channel that I was talking about is Stay Curious, my friends, on TikTok. Depending on when you hear this, if TikTok even exists anymore, who knows? Regardless, Brandon has not been updating that TikTok in quite some time, but he's feels very guilty about that, and in third person really wants to get back into making great historical and science stories.
So in the meantime, if you want to hear historical stories by Brandon, you can subscribe and like and follow Badass of the Week, the podcast, because
there you can.
Coming on here and doing that pretty regularly as well.
Love it, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much, and thank you guys for listening. We hope you like this one, and we hope to see you again soon on the next episode. Stay badass. Badass of the Week is produced by High Five Content. Executive producers are me, Ben Thompson, Dr. Patricia Larish, and Andrew Jacobs. Writing is by me and Pat. Story editing by Ian Jacobs. Mixing and music and sound design by Jude Brewer. Special thanks to Noel Brown at iHeartRadio. Badass of the Week is based on my website, badassoftheweek.com, where you can read all sorts of stories about other badasses. If you want to reach out with questions or ideas, you can email us at badasspodcast@badassoftheweek.com. If you like this podcast, please subscribe, follow, listen, and tell your friends and tell your enemies. And please leave us a rating. We'll be back next week with another one.